The Talmud is the most studied legal and ethical document in the history of Judaism. It is also one of the least understood documents in the history of the world. Most people who have heard of it have never read a page of it. Most people who have an opinion about it are working from rumors, from caricatures, from the centuries of distortion, sometimes hostile, sometimes reverent, that have accumulated around a text of almost incomprehensible depth and complexity. The Talmud is not a book of prayers. It is not a collection of commandments. It is not a theological treatise in the philosophical sense. It is something stranger and more interesting than any of those things. It is a record of argument, a record of disagreement, a record of some of the most brilliant minds in Jewish history wrestling with the full range of human experience, including, with extraordinary sophistication and extraordinary practicality, the question of how human beings should relate to money, to wealth, to business, to the obligations that arise between people who have and people who do not. And what those minds concluded over centuries of debate forms one of the most nuanced, most psychologically sophisticated, and most practically useful bodies of economic thought that any religious tradition has ever produced. Almost none of it is known outside the Jewish world. Almost none of it has made its way into the popular conversation about religion and money that dominates bookstore shelves and podcast episodes and Sunday morning sermons. The prosperity gospel tells you that God wants you to be rich and that giving money to a preacher is an investment with divine returns. The ascetic traditions tell you that wealth is spiritually dangerous and that the good person holds it lightly or abandons it entirely. The Talmud does neither. The Talmud looks at money the way it looks at everything, with both eyes open, with complete intellectual honesty, with a refusal to flatten something complex into something comfortable. And what it says will surprise you. Whether you are rich or poor, religious or secular, Jewish or not, what the Talmud says about wealth is worth knowing, because it was arrived at by people who had thought about it more carefully and more honestly than almost anyone since. Welcome to Sacred Mysteries, where ancient secrets meet modern questions. To understand what the Talmud says about wealth, you have to understand what the Talmud is and how it works, because the Talmud is not a book that gives you answers in the way that most books give you answers. It is a book that gives you the arguments, all of them, including the ones that lost. This is the feature of Talmudic discourse that surprises people most when they encounter it for the first time. In the Talmud, when Rabbi X and Rabbi Y disagree about something, and they disagree about almost everything, both positions are recorded. The minority view is preserved alongside the majority ruling. The dissent is not erased, and the reason is explicit. The tradition says that both these and these are the words of the living God. Both positions, the one that won and the one that lost. Both are preserved because the tradition understood something that most legal and theological systems have, not that a position which is wrong today may be right tomorrow. That circumstances change. That the losing argument of one generation may be the saving argument of the next. This is the foundation of Talmudic thinking. And it means that when we talk about what the Talmud says about wealth, we are not talking about a single authoritative position. We are talking about a conversation, a centuries-long, extraordinarily rich conversation conducted by people who lived in radically different economic circumstances in the agricultural communities of Roman Palestine, in the trading cities of Babylonia, in the academies of Pumdadita and Sura, in medieval Europe and North Africa and the Ottoman Empire, and who brought all of those circumstances to bear on questions that never stopped being urgent. How do you earn money honestly? How do you protect what you have earned? How do you give it away? How much do you owe to others? When does wealth become an obstacle to the life you are supposed to be living? And when does poverty become an obstacle to the same thing? Let's start with the foundation. The Talmud's attitude toward wealth begins not with money, but with work. The obligation to work to earn one's living through one's own labor is not treated in the Talmud as a curse or a punishment, the way it is sometimes treated in readings of the Genesis account, where God tells Adam that by the sweat of his face he will eat bread. In the Talmud, work is dignified, work is a religious obligation. The tractate Kedushin contains a famous teaching that a father is obligated to teach his son a trade, and whoever does not teach his son a trade teaches him to steal, not because work is the only path to wealth, but because the alternative to honest work, dependence on others, or worse, taking what belongs to others, is incompatible with the kind of person that Torah wants you to be. Rabbi Judah in the same tractate goes further. He says that work is greater than the merit of one's ancestors, greater than the merit of your parents, your grandparents, the chain of righteous people who came before you. Your own work, your own honest effort in the world carries more spiritual weight than inherited virtue. This is a remarkable position. In a tradition that places enormous weight on ancestry, on the chain of transmission from generation to generation, Rabbi Judah is saying that what you do matters more than where you come from. That personal effort and personal responsibility are not just economically important, they are spiritually central. The Talmudic tractate Barakat contains another teaching that has shaped Jewish attitudes toward economic life in ways that are still visible today. It says that a person should always pray that they should not need the gifts of flesh and blood, meaning the charity of other human beings, not because receiving charity is shameful. The Talmud has an enormous amount to say about the obligation to give charity, and it treats the recipient of charity with full human dignity. But because dependence, structural, ongoing dependence on others for one's basic needs compromises the autonomy and the dignity that the tradition wants every human being to possess, the goal is not wealth for its own sake. The goal is the self-sufficiency that makes full human flourishing possible. On the question of how wealth should be earned, the Talmud is extraordinarily specific and extraordinarily demanding. The concept of ona'ah, roughly translated as price fraud or overreaching, is one of the most developed areas of Talmudic commercial law. The basic rule, derived from Leviticus 25, is that you may not overcharge or underpay by more than 1/6 of the fair market price of any commodity. If you do, the transaction can be voided. The party who was cheated can demand either the return of the overcharged amount or the cancellation of the entire deal. This applies not just to physical goods, but in rabbinic expansion, to labor, to land, and to financial instruments. The concept of ona'ah also extends beyond price to what the Talmud calls ona'at devarim, verbal overreaching, or causing pain through words. You may not ask a merchant the price of something you have no intention of buying. You may not remind a person who has repented of past sins what those sins were. You may not refer to a convert's non-Jewish origins in a way that causes them pain. The economic concept of not overreaching expands into an entire ethics of how you treat people in the marketplace and beyond. It an ethics that treats psychological harm with the same legal seriousness as financial harm. This integration of psychological and economic ethics is one of the most distinctive features of Talmudic commercial law. It refuses the separation that modern business culture often makes between legal compliance and human decency. The Talmud says you can comply with the letter of the law and still be causing harm. And causing harm, even within technically legal transactions, is not acceptable. The concept of lifnim mishurat hadin, going beyond the letter of the law, appears repeatedly in Talmudic discussions of commercial disputes. The law may permit you to do something, but the tradition expects you to ask a further question. Is what the law permits the right thing to do in this specific situation with these specific people in these specific circumstances? A story in the tractate Bava Metzia illustrates this with unusual force. Rabba bar Hanan had hired porters to carry barrels of wine. The porters were careless and the barrels broke. Rabba confiscated their cloaks as compensation. They complained to Rav, the leading authority of his generation. Rav told Rabba to return the cloaks. Rabba said, "Is this the law?" Rav said, "Yes, this is the law. You shall walk in the way of good people." Then the porters said, "We are poor men. We worked all day. We are hungry. We have nothing." Rav told Rava to pay them their wages for the day as well. Rava said again, "Is this the law?" Rav said again, "Yes, and keep the paths of the righteous." The barrels broke through negligence. The law might have allowed Rava to keep the cloaks and refuse the wages, but the tradition expected him to see not just the legal situation, but the human situation. Poor men, a full day of work, hunger. The tradition expected him to respond to that human reality even at personal financial cost. This is not charity, this is justice. The Talmud does not always separate the two as cleanly as modern ethics sometimes tries to. On the question of lending and interest, the Talmud developed one of the most sophisticated bodies of financial law in the ancient world, and its complexity reflects a genuine ethical tension that the tradition never pretended to resolve neatly. The Torah prohibition on charging interest ribbit in Hebrew is explicit. You shall not charge interest to your brother, whether on money or food or anything else that may be lent at interest. This prohibition applies between Jews. It does not, in the biblical text, apply to transactions with non-Jews. The Talmud elaborates this prohibition in extraordinary detail. Not only is charging explicit interest forbidden, but any transaction in which the lender receives more than he lent, however indirectly, however subtly, is potentially prohibited. If you lend someone money and before they repay you, they send you a gift, the gift may be considered indirect interest and therefore forbidden. If you lend money and the borrower greets you more warmly than usual before repayment, if he says good morning to you when he never used to, that is considered potential interest. The tradition calls this avac ribbit, the dust of interest. The prohibition extends to the edges of the imaginable. At the same time, the Talmud recognized that a complete prohibition on interest-bearing financial transactions would make commercial life impossible. Trade requires credit, businesses require investment, and so the tradition developed a legal instrument called the heter iska, literally a permit for a business transaction which allowed money to be advanced in a way that resembled a partnership rather than a loan, so that the return to the investor was technically a share of profit rather than interest. The heter iska has been described by legal historians as one of the most ingenious financial instruments in the pre-modern world. It allowed the Jewish communities of medieval Europe to participate fully in the credit economy while technically complying with the prohibition on interest. And it reveals something important about how the Talmudic tradition approached the tension between ideal and reality. The ideal was a world without exploitative lending. The reality was a world in which credit was essential, and completely prohibiting it would harm the very people the prohibition was designed to protect. The tradition found a way to honor both, not by pretending the tension did not exist, but by engineering a solution that acknowledged the reality while preserving as much of the ideal as possible. The Talmud's teachings on wealth are not only about how to earn it and manage it, they are equally, perhaps more urgently, about how to give it away. The concept of tzedakah, usually translated as charity, but more precisely meaning righteousness or justice, is one of the most developed ethical concepts in the entire Jewish tradition. And the Talmud's treatment of it is one of the places where its practical wisdom is most striking and most applicable to the contemporary world. The first and most fundamental teaching about tzedakah in the Talmud is that it is not optional. It is not a virtue that some people choose to practice and others do not. It is an obligation. A legal obligation binding on every Jew who has any means at all. The Talmud specifies that one should give between 10 and 20% of one's net income to tzedakah. 10% is the minimum. 20% is the maximum. The tradition was concerned that giving more than 20% might impoverish the giver and make them a burden on others, reversing the intended direction of the obligation. This is not a suggestion. It is a binding legal norm, as obligatory as any other commandment in Jewish law. The Talmud then goes further, much further, in specifying how tzedakah should be given. The medieval philosopher Maimonides, drawing on Talmudic sources, codified 8 levels of tzedakah arranged in order of moral worth. The lowest level is giving reluctantly, under pressure, after being asked. The next level is giving cheerfully but too little, then giving only after being asked, then giving before being asked, then giving when you do not know who will receive it but the recipient knows who gave it. Then giving when you know who will receive it, but they do not know who gave it. Then giving when neither party knows the identity of the other, anonymous giving to an anonymous recipient. And the highest level of all the level that the entire structure of tzedakah is trying to produce is giving someone the means to become self-sufficient. A job, a loan, a partnership, a skill, not a gift that the recipient will need again tomorrow, but the kind of help that ends the need for help. This hierarchy encodes a profound psychological insight. The lower forms of tzedakah, while valuable, preserve the power differential between giver and receiver. The giver is generous, the receiver is dependent. The highest form of tzedakah collapses that differential entirely. The goal is not to be a good giver. The goal is to create a world in which giving is no longer necessary. This is not utopian thinking. This is practical ethics of the highest order. It says, yes, give. Give generously, give anonymously, give cheerfully. But the ultimate purpose of giving is not to feel good about your generosity. It is to help the recipient become someone who no longer needs your generosity. The tractate Shabbat contains a famous exchange between a potential convert and the great sage Hillel. The convert comes to Hillel and says, "Teach me the whole Torah while I stand on one foot." Hillel says, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and learn. The application of this principle to wealth is direct and demanding. If poverty is hateful to you, if you would not want to experience what the poor person experiences, then you are obligated to act, not to feel sympathy. Not to donate occasionally when moved by a particular case, to act systematically as a matter of obligation to reduce the conditions that produce the poverty you would not want to experience yourself." The Talmud also has things to say about wealth that are less comfortable, things that cut against the instinct to treat accumulation as a straightforward good. The Tractate of Ot, the Ethics of the Fathers, one of the most accessible sections of the Talmud, contains a teaching that is simple enough to fit on a bumper sticker and profound enough to spend a lifetime unpacking. Who is rich? He who is satisfied with his portion, not he who has the most, not he who has earned more than his parents, not he who has reached a certain number, he who is satisfied with what he has. This teaching is not about poverty or about the virtue of having little. It is about the relationship between what you have and what you want. The Talmud is not naive about human psychology. It knows that the desire for more does not stop when you reach a target. The Ecclesiastes, which is part of the Hebrew Bible and was deeply influential on Talmudic thinking, says this explicitly: "One who loves money will not be satisfied with money." The accumulation instinct, unexamined, is a machine that does not have an off switch. The Talmudic response to this is not asceticism, give everything away and want nothing. It is cultivated satisfaction. The ability to look at what you have and recognize it as enough, not because you have stopped caring about your situation, but because you have developed the wisdom to distinguish between what you actually need and what the desire machine keeps telling you that you need. The Tractate Sanhedrin contains a startling teaching about the moral risks of wealth accumulation that goes further than most religious traditions are willing to go. It says, "A person does not leave this world with even half of his desires fulfilled. If he has 100, he wants 200. If he has 200, he wants 400. The desire doubles with each satisfaction. This is not presented as a moral failing unique to bad people. It is presented as a structural feature of human desire, a feature that the wise person needs to understand and consciously work against, not by giving up desire entirely. The Talmud is not a tradition of desire elimination, but by developing a relationship with desire that does not let it run unchecked, that submits it to the examination of what actually matters and what does not. There is one more dimension of the Talmud's economic wisdom that deserves its own space, because it addresses something that no other ancient legal tradition addresses with the same clarity. The question of how you treat the person who works for you. The Tractate Bava Metzia contains some of the most demanding labor law in the ancient world. The employer's obligation to pay wages promptly, not at the end of the week, not at the end of the month, but on the day the work is done, before the sun sets, is treated not as a courtesy, but as a legal obligation whose violation constitutes a serious sin. The verse from Leviticus 19 is explicit. The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you all night until the morning. Delaying payment is not just poor practice, it is theft. It is taking, temporarily, what belongs to another person. And the Talmud extends this logic in directions that feel remarkably contemporary. An employer who hires a worker under certain conditions and then changes those conditions without the worker's agreement has violated the worker's autonomy in a way that the tradition treats with the same seriousness as financial fraud. A worker who agrees to do a job and then refuses to finish it at a critical moment when the employer cannot easily find a replacement and real harm will result is also held responsible for that harm. The obligations run in both directions. Neither party to a labor relationship has absolute power over the other. Both are bound by obligations that the market alone does not create. This vision of the labor relationship as a web of mutual obligations, not merely a contract between parties with unequal power, in which the more powerful party sets all the terms, is one of the Talmud's most distinctive and most practically significant contributions to economic thought. It does not abolish the market. It does not pretend that employer and employee have equal power, but it insists that power does not equal right, that having the power to delay wages does not give you the right to delay them, that having the power to change working conditions unilaterally does not mean you are permitted to do so. The Talmud is asking, in every area of economic life, the same question it asks everywhere else. Not what can you do, but what should you do? And the answer is always the same. You should do what you would want done to you if the positions were reversed. What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Perhaps the most distinctive feature of the Talmud's economic wisdom is its insistence that wealth is never purely private. The tradition of peha, the requirement to leave the corners of one's field unharvested so that the poor could come and take from them, is biblical in origin. But the Talmud elaborates it into a comprehensive system of obligations that make the very concept of private property conditional. What you own, but what you own comes with obligations attached. The poor have a legal claim, not a moral appeal, a legal claim on a portion of what you produce. The stranger, the widow, the orphan, the categories of vulnerable people that the Torah mentions repeatedly are not objects of your optional generosity. They are legal stakeholders in your economic activity. This is not socialism in the modern sense. The Talmud fully accepts private ownership of property and the right to profit from one's labor and investment. But it refuses the conclusion that private ownership is absolute, that what is mine is entirely mine and I owe nothing to anyone beyond my contractual obligations. The tradition says you are a steward of what you have, not merely an owner, and stewardship carries obligations that ownership alone does not. The full scope of what the Talmud contains on these questions, on honest commerce, on the ethics of lending, on the obligations of wealth, on the psychology of desire and satisfaction, on the legal rights of the poor, cannot be contained in a single video. It took centuries of the most sophisticated minds in the Jewish world to develop these ideas, and it takes years of study to begin to understand them in their full complexity and their full depth. But what can be said here, clearly and without qualification, is this: the Talmud is not a book of secrets. It is a book of wisdom that has been hiding in plain sight for 2,000 years, studied intensively by the communities that produced it, and almost entirely unknown to the rest of the world. The wealth secrets in the Talmud are not secrets in the sense of hidden formulas or esoteric knowledge accessible only to the initiated. They are secrets only in the sense that they have not been read by the people who could benefit most from reading them. People trying to build businesses with integrity. People trying to understand their obligations to their employees and their communities. People trying to figure out how much is enough and what to do with what they have beyond enough. People trying to live in a world organized around the accumulation of money without being consumed by it. The Talmud has thought about all of these questions more carefully, more honestly, and with more psychological sophistication than almost any other tradition. And it has reached conclusions that are not comfortable, not simple, and not what the prosperity gospel or the self-help section of any bookstore will tell you. It will tell you that work is sacred, but accumulation is not the point, that honest dealing is not optional, that the poor have legal claims on your wealth, not just moral appeals to your generosity. That satisfaction with what you have is a greater achievement than getting more, and that the highest form of generosity is the kind that makes generosity unnecessary. Whether those conclusions are true, whether they match your own experience of how wealth works and what it is for that, is the question worth bringing to your own life. Leave your answer in the comments. What surprises you most about what the Talmud says, and what do you wish more people knew about it? And next time, we are going to stay in the Jewish mystical tradition, but go somewhere much stranger. We are going to open the Kabbalah, not the pop culture version sold in red string bracelets, the real thing. The system of divine emanations, the map of the soul, the hidden name of God that the tradition says contains all of creation within it. And the reason it was kept secret for so long that only those over 40, already married, already grounded in the rest of Jewish learning, were supposed to study it at all. Stay curious.